He didn't forget. That's the part that broke her. Luca Moretti, a man who ran half of Seoul's underground logistics empire without ever losing track of a single shipment, a single meeting, a single enemy, chose not to come. While his 32-week pregnant wife sat alone in a hospital waiting room clutching an ultrasound photograph, he was pouring champagne for another woman on a rooftop above the Han River. Candles, violin music, his hand resting on someone else's waist. And by the time Naomi Carter Moretti walked out of that hospital, carrying their son's first heartbeat image in a small white envelope, the photographs were already online. She didn't scream, she didn't call. She simply went home, made dinner, and set a thick envelope beside his plate. Inside were divorce papers. Beside them was the ultrasound photo he never showed up to see. If that were you, if the person who promised to stand beside you chose a party over your child's first heartbeat, could you have stayed as calm as she did, or would you have shattered long before she did? Before we go further, if stories like this one stay with you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning started the way most catastrophic mornings do, quietly and without warning. Naomi woke at 5:47, not because her alarm went off, because her back had been aching for 3 days straight, the kind of low, persistent ache that no pillow arrangement could fix, and because at 32 weeks pregnant, sleep had stopped being something that happened to her and had become something she chased in 40-minute stretches between bathroom trips and the baby's kicks. She lay still for a moment, one hand resting on her stomach. The apartment was dark and cool. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Hanam-dong penthouse, Seoul glittered in the pre-dawn silence like something out of a movie she hadn't agreed to star in. She could hear Luca in the next room. Phone calls. Low voice. The particular cadence he used when he was managing something that couldn't wait. Clipped sentences, long pauses, the occasional single syllable that somehow carried the weight of a full directive. Even after 4 years of marriage, that voice still made the air in the room feel different, heavier. She didn't get up immediately. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. She'd started counting them, sometime in the past year, those small private windows before the day began, to feel whatever she needed to feel before she put her face back together. This morning, what she felt was something she couldn't quite name. Not dread, not hope, something closer to a held breath. Today was the 32-week appointment. She had reminded Luca 3 times. Once in person, 2 weeks ago, after she'd scheduled it. Once by text message last Thursday. And once, because she hated herself a little for needing to, yesterday morning, casually, over coffee, keeping her voice light. Tomorrow's the appointment, remember? The one with the heartbeat monitor. He'd looked up from his phone. I know. 2 words. But the way he said them, not reassurance, just confirmation that the information had been received and logged, made her feel like an item on a calendar. Not a wife. Not the mother of his child. An appointment. She told herself she was reading too much into it. She was very, very good at telling herself that. By 6:30, she was dressed. She'd chosen her clothes the night before, a cream-colored blouse that still fit over her stomach without pulling, dark trousers, the low boots Luca had bought her in Milan before she got pregnant, back when he still did things like surprise her with gifts from cities she hadn't visited. She looked in the bathroom mirror and practiced her expression the way she'd been practicing it for months. Calm. Together. Fine. She was not fine, but she was practiced. Luca was off the phone when she walked into the kitchen. He was standing at the counter in a dark suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, scrolling through something on his phone with the focused attention he gave to everything except, lately, her. He looked up when she came in. "You're up early," he said. "Appointment's at 9. Something crossed his face. Quick, gone before she could name it. Right. She poured herself a glass of water because coffee was off limits, and because she needed something to do with her hands. "Are you ready? We should leave by 8 to beat the Gangnam traffic." He set his phone face down on the counter. That gesture, she'd learned to read it. It meant a conversation was coming that he'd been rehearsing. "Something came up," he said. The glass was cold in her hand. "What kind of something?" "Kim's people. There's a discrepancy in the Incheon routing, about 4 million in transit that's showing up in the wrong column. If I don't sit down with them this morning, we lose the contract. He was already reaching for his phone again. It's not optional. Naomi stood very still. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of the specific quality of silence in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the city waking up 30 floors below them. Luca. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. This is the heartbeat appointment. I know what it is. They put the monitor on my stomach and we listened to him. Together. That's what we've been waiting for since the last visit. You told me. I know what I said. There it was. Flat. Not cruel. Which was almost worse than cruel. Cruelty at least would have given her something to push against. I'll make it next time, he said. And before she could respond, his phone lit up and he was already walking toward the study. Take the car. Tell them I said hello. The door didn't slam. That was the thing about Luca. His doors never slammed. Everything he did was controlled, measured, completely certain of itself. He didn't need to slam doors. Doors simply got closed. Naomi stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left. She put down the water glass. She picked up her keys. She walked out. The car ride to the hospital took 41 minutes. She knew because she counted. She sat in the back seat of the car they kept for daytime use, not the armored one Luca used, just a regular black sedan. And she looked out the window at Soul sliding past, and she thought about the first time Luca had put his hand on her stomach and felt the baby move 3 months ago, in the middle of a Tuesday night when he'd come home late and she'd been awake reading. He'd gone completely still, like the entire architecture of who he was had briefly paused. And when he looked at her, there was something in his face she'd never seen before. Not the Luca who ran meetings and closed contracts and made people afraid. Someone else. Someone newer. She had thought, this is it. This is what changes things. She had been wrong. The hospital waiting room was pastel and bright in the way that hospitals try to make things feel manageable. There were 6 other couples there. She counted those too. 6 pairs of hands intertwined, 6 people leaning into each other over the particular shared anxiety of waiting for news about a life that didn't yet have a name for the outside world. Naomi took the seat in the corner and kept her coat on. The nurse who called her back was young and cheerful in a practiced way. She asked about symptoms, about sleep, about whether Naomi had any questions. Naomi answered all of it correctly. She was very good at answering correctly. The stethoscope came out. The gel went on. The monitor crackled. And then, there it was. Fast and rhythmic and absolutely certain of itself. A heartbeat that didn't know anything about routing contracts or penthouse apartments or the particular silence of a kitchen at 6:40 in the morning. A heartbeat that only knew how to keep going. Naomi pressed her lips together. The nurse was saying something about the rate, about the positioning, about how everything looked healthy and strong. Naomi heard it all from a great distance, because what she was actually hearing was a small, fierce drumbeat that had no idea its father wasn't in the room. She asked for the printed image. The nurse handed it over in a small white envelope with the hospital's logo in the corner. Naomi held it with both hands. Such a small thing. Such a plain container for something that would outlive every mistake either of its parents had ever made. She thanked the nurse. She walked back through the waiting room. She didn't look at the couples. She texted Luca from the car. Everything healthy. Strong heartbeat. Doctor says he's in good position. She stared at the message for a moment after she sent it. Then she added, I wished you were there. He replied 11 minutes later. Good news. I'll be late tonight. She put the phone in her bag. She told herself, stop waiting for something that isn't coming. She had been telling herself that for 8 months, and she had not yet listened. The afternoon moved the way afternoons do when you're waiting for something to go wrong. Slowly, and with the particular false calm of a day that has decided to take its time. Naomi worked from the apartment for 3 hours, answering emails for the consulting work she'd been doing quietly, carefully, building something small and hers in the spaces Luca didn't occupy. She had a gift for logistics, always had, since her days in Chicago when she'd turned around a mid-sized freight company at 28, the kind of professional achievement that gets written up in trade journals and then quietly shelved when you follow a man to another country and become, in the eyes of most people around you, primarily a wife. She hadn't meant to lose herself. She'd done it gradually, the way most intelligent women lose themselves, by being reasonable, by being accommodating, by deciding that the relationship was the project now and everything else could wait. At 4:17 in the afternoon, her phone started vibrating. Not a call, messages. 4 in rapid succession from 4 different people. A college friend in Chicago, a woman she knew from the expat community in Itaewon, her cousin in Atlanta, and a number she didn't recognize. The messages all said variations of the same thing, and each one landed like a separate blow delivered to the same spot. "Are you okay?" "I'm so sorry, Naomi. I don't know what to say. Call me when you can, please." "Did you see the photos?" She didn't want to look. She knew, with the specific clarity of a person who has been quietly dreading exactly this moment for longer than they've admitted to anyone, that looking would change something permanently, that there is a version of not knowing that, once ended, cannot be restored. She looked. The photographs were from someone's social media account, a lifestyle blogger from what she could gather, someone who frequented the kind of rooftop venues that got photographed for their aesthetic. The post had been reshared several hundred times by the time Naomi found it. The caption was in Korean, but the images needed no translation. Luca, rooftop, and river at golden hour behind him, a table with candles, a violin quartet visible in the background, and beside him, leaning into him, her hand on his arm, laughing at something he'd just said, a woman Naomi had never seen before. Dark hair, beautiful. The body language of someone who was very comfortable where she was. There were 6 photographs. Naomi looked at all 6. In the last one, Luca was smiling. She could not remember the last time she had seen him smile like that. Not the controlled professional expression he used in meetings or the particular tilt of his mouth when something went the way he'd planned. A real smile. The kind that happens to a face before the face knows it's happening. She set her phone down on the kitchen counter. She walked to the window. Below, Seoul continued exactly as it had been. 30 floors of ordinary distance between her and the world. She put both hands on her stomach. The baby moved, a small, rolling pressure against her palm. "It's okay," she said quietly. To him. To herself. To whatever combination of the two she could manage. "It's okay." It was not okay. But she said it again anyway. She didn't call Luca. She didn't text him. She didn't call her friends back. She spent the next 2 hours doing something that would have surprised everyone who knew her. She cleaned. Methodically, completely, the kind of cleaning that isn't really about dirt. She moved through every room of the apartment with a particular focus, straightening things that were already straight, putting away things that had already been put away. Her hands needed to do something that had a clear result, something finite. Then she went to the desk in the corner of the bedroom, the one she used for her consulting work, the one Luca had never once sat at, and she opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder she had been adding to for the better part of a year. She had told herself it was precautionary. She had told herself she hoped to never need it. She had told herself a great many things. She took out the folder and set it on the desk and opened it. Inside were documents, legal documents, papers she'd had drawn up quietly by a lawyer in Yongsan that none of their mutual acquaintances knew, paid for out of the separate account she'd been maintaining since the first time she decided she needed one. Divorce papers. Already prepared, already reviewed, waiting for the moment she stopped telling herself she was reading too much into things. She took them out. She paper-clipped them together with the careful precision of someone who has already cried all the tears available for this particular grief and has come out the other side into something quieter and much more dangerous, clarity. Then she reached for the white envelope from the hospital, the one she'd been carrying since morning. She slid the ultrasound photograph out and looked at it for a long moment. The gray blur of a face, the curve of a spine, the small-fisted hand caught mid-motion by the scanner. Evidence of a person who didn't yet know what world he was being born into. She placed it carefully on top of the divorce papers. She carried both to the dining table. She set them beside his plate. Then she went to the kitchen and started making dinner. She made the pasta he liked, the one with the particular red sauce she'd learned from his mother during the one visit to Italy that had felt, briefly, like they were a real family. She made it correctly. She set the table correctly. She lit the small candle they sometimes had at dinner and hadn't used in 4 months. She was in the kitchen when she heard his key in the door. She didn't come out immediately. She waited. She listened to the particular sequence of sounds that meant he was home. The door, the coat, the phone set down on the entryway table. Then silence, longer than usual. Then his voice from the dining room. "Naomi." Not a question, just her name. She came out of the kitchen and stood in the doorway. I was standing at the table, still in his coat, the envelope in his hands. He'd opened it. He was looking at the ultrasound photo with an expression she couldn't read from across the room. Where did... Hospital, she said. This morning. He looked up. You were alone, he said. Yes. Something moved through his face. She watched it carefully. She had spent 4 years learning to read the language of his face, and what she saw now was not guilt exactly, because Luca Moretti had never once in his life been a man who looked guilty. It was more like the first second after someone realizes they've miscalculated. The brief, very specific expression of a man who was certain he had more time than he did. Naomi. His voice was lower now. The Luca who gave directives was gone. This was something older. I can explain. The dinner was for her birthday, she said. It wasn't a question. The pause before his answer was 3 seconds. She counted. It wasn't... I don't want to know what it was, she said. I don't need you to explain it. Then what do you... I wanted our son to hear his father's voice today. Her voice was completely even. She had rehearsed this somewhere in the last 2 hours without realizing she was rehearsing it. The doctor puts a monitor on my stomach, and you can hear the heartbeat, and usually the father says something, hello, or I love you, or even just his name. Anything, just so the baby hears that he's there. Luca was very still. He heard only mine, she said. The candle on the table burned between them. She watched him look down at the ultrasound photo again, then at the papers beneath it. She watched him understand what the papers were. She watched the understanding arrive in his body. Not in his face, Luca never let things arrive in his face, but in the slight shift of his shoulders, the way his hand very carefully set the envelope back down on the table. You had these prepared, he said. Yes. For how long? Long enough. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't, and she didn't know how long. Long enough that she'd stopped noticing when he stopped. Naomi, don't, she said, gently. That was the thing no one who heard this story would ever quite believe. How gentle her voice was. Don't start a sentence you're only going to finish because you're afraid. He didn't finish the sentence. For the first time in their marriage, Luca Moretti stood in a room he controlled. The apartment he'd chosen, the furniture he'd approved, the city he'd made his, and had absolutely nothing to say. The pasta cooled in the kitchen, the candle burned. Their son's heartbeat continued, steady and indifferent to all of it, inside the body of the woman who had just, very quietly, made the last decision she would ever make inside these walls. Naomi walked to the bedroom. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. She slept on her side of the bed with her back to the door, which was how she'd been sleeping for months. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a position she'd chosen rather than fallen into. Luca didn't come to bed. She knew because she lay awake until 2 in the morning, listening. She heard him move through the apartment, the kitchen, the study, back to the kitchen, with the particular restlessness of a man who was used to solving problems and had just encountered one that didn't respond to pressure. She heard the low sound of his voice once, briefly, a phone call he kept short. She heard ice in a glass. She did not hear him cry. She hadn't expected to. Luca Moretti didn't cry. She'd seen him receive news of a man's death without blinking. She'd watched him sit across from people who wanted him afraid and give them nothing, not a tremor, not a tell, not a single indication that anything they said had reached him. Whatever lived inside him that other people called feeling, he'd spent a long time building walls around it, and the walls were very good. That had attracted her once. The steadiness of him. After a childhood spent in a house where every emotion was performed at full volume and nothing was ever resolved, Luca's stillness had felt like safety. It had taken her 4 years to understand that stillness and safety are not the same thing. At 2:14, she heard the study door close. At 2:15, she got up, went to the bathroom, drank a glass of water, looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, and went back to bed. She slept 4 hours. Dreamless. In the morning, he was at the kitchen table when she came out, still in yesterday's clothes. He had the coffee made, which surprised her. He rarely made coffee. They had a machine that Naomi usually operated because Luca had never learned its particular temperament. The coffee he'd made was too strong. She could smell it from across the room. He looked up when she came in. Naomi. His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard before. Not hungover. Luca rarely drank enough to show it. Just stripped of something. The top layer of him, gone. She went to the cabinet and got a glass for water. "Sit down," he said. "Please. I have a call at 8. It's 6:40. She filled the glass. She stood at the counter with her back to him and drank half of it. Then she turned around because not turning around felt like a performance, and she was done performing. He looked terrible. Not disheveled. Luca never looked fully disheveled. Even in day-old clothes, there was something composed about him. But his eyes were the eyes of a man who'd been awake all night arguing with himself and losing. "What do you want to say?" she said. Not unkindly, just precisely. "I want to say—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. "The dinner last—" "It wasn't what you think." She set the glass down. "Luca, I'm not asking you to forgive anything," he said quickly. "I know how it looked. The photographs—" "How long?" He went quiet. "How long has it been going on?" she said. Same tone, same even, terrible, calm. "It hasn't been— There's nothing going on." "Then what was the dinner?" "She's someone I've been—" He stopped again, ran a hand over his face. In 4 years she had never seen him struggle for words. He had always known exactly what to say and exactly how much of it to say. Watching him search for language now felt like watching a very competent machine break down mid-operation. "It's complicated. Uncomplicated. Naomi." "You missed the appointment," she said. The words came out harder than she'd meant them to. Not hard in volume, her voice never went loud, but hard the way stone is hard, the way something becomes when it's been compressed long enough. "You sent me a text message. While I was sitting in a waiting room surrounded by people who came together, you sent me a 2-line text and went to a birthday dinner for a woman I have never heard you mention. It wasn't a—" "Stop." She held up one hand, flat. "Stop telling me what it wasn't. Tell me what it was." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, Seoul was starting its morning noise, a distant horn, the sound of the city shifting gears. Luca looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Her name is Selena." And there it was. She'd known the answer. She'd known it since the photographs. But hearing a name out loud did something particular. It gave the thing shape, made it real in the specific way that names make things real. "Selena," she repeated. We've known each other since before you and I— How long has it been going on?" He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he said, 7 months. 7 months. She was doing the math without meaning to. 7 months ago, she had been 4 months pregnant. 7 months ago, they had stood together in this apartment, and he had told her that he wanted their son to grow up understanding what loyalty meant. She picked up her glass and finished the water and set it back down. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" His voice cracked on the word. "I mean, I understand now." She turned toward the hallway. "I'm going to get dressed." "Naomi, wait." "For what, Luca?" She stopped but didn't turn back. "You've told me the truth, which I appreciate. What do you want me to say to that? What answer are you looking for?" Silence. "I made a mistake." His voice was very low. "I know that doesn't—" "A mistake is one night," she said. 7 months is a decision." She went to the bedroom. She heard him push back from the table. She heard him stand up. She heard him cross the kitchen to the hallway. "Don't follow me into this room," she said, without turning around. He stopped. She closed the bedroom door. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands over her face and stayed that way for exactly 90 seconds. Then she got up, went to the closet, and began selecting the clothes she would need for the day. She moved methodically, precisely, the way she moved through everything now. She had a call at 8. She had work to do. She had a son who needed her to not fall apart in a closet in Hanam-dong. She showered. She dressed. She did not cry. When she came back out, Luca was still in the hallway. He had changed his shirt. He was leaning against the wall outside the bedroom door with his arms crossed, and when she appeared, he straightened up with the look of a man who had been rehearsing something. "I want to talk about the papers," he said. "I know you do." "You can't— Naomi, you're 32 weeks pregnant. You can't do this right now." She looked at him. "Can't do what?" "Leave. Whatever you're planning." He unfolded his arms. "I understand you're angry. I understand you have every— I'm not angry, she said. And the thing was, it was true. She had passed through anger sometime in the night while she lay awake listening to him move through rooms he owned. And what she had arrived at on the other side was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not peace. Closer to resolve. The specific internal stillness of someone who has finally made a decision they'd been avoiding for a very long time. He stared at her. Then what are you? I'm done, she said simply. Something crossed his face that she'd never seen there before. Something that in another man, in a less controlled man, she might have called panic. You're not— He stopped. Listen to me. I know what I did. I'm not trying to make excuses, but we have a son coming. In 8 weeks we have— I know exactly how many weeks we have, she said. I'm the one who's been counting. Then you know this isn't the time. When would be the time? She asked it genuinely, not as a trap, not as a rhetorical move. She actually wanted to know. When he's born? When he's a year old? When he starts asking where his father is in the evenings? When exactly were you planning to stop? And when would you have told me? And when was I supposed to find that acceptable? Luca said nothing. There isn't a good time, she said. That's what you're learning right now. There was only the time before this, and that time is over. She walked past him to the entryway. She got her coat. She picked up the bag she'd packed the night before. Just the essentials, just what she needed for the day. And she opened the front door. Naomi. His voice came from behind her, and there was something in it she hadn't heard in a very long time. Something unpracticed, something that had bypassed the walls. Please. She stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. Please don't do this today, he said. Come back tonight. Yell at me, throw something, do whatever you need to, but please don't walk out that door like this. She thought about the waiting room, the 6 couples, the empty chair. You know what I wanted? She said quietly to the hallway ahead of her. I didn't want flowers. I didn't want an apology. I wanted you to sit in an uncomfortable hospital chair for 40 minutes and hold my hand while a nurse put gel on my stomach. That's all. That was the whole thing. She heard him exhale behind her. I'll be there next time, he said. I swear to you, there isn't a next time. She stepped out into the corridor. There was only this time, and you chose. She pulled the door closed behind her. She pressed the elevator button and waited, staring at the brushed metal doors, and she thought, I am 32 weeks pregnant, and I just walked out of my life and my hands are completely steady. She looked down at them. They were. Completely steady. The elevator arrived. She got in. The next 72 hours were not clean or cinematic in any way. They were the kind of hours that happen in the gaps between big moments, the hours that don't get remembered clearly because the body and mind are both operating in a kind of emergency register where efficiency replaces feeling. Naomi went to the hotel she'd already identified. She'd done the research 3 months ago, which said something about how long she'd known this was coming. A mid-range place in Mapo where nobody would recognize her, where the staff were professional and incurious, where she could have a room with a firm bed and a small desk and think. She called her lawyer from the hotel room. The lawyer, a woman named Ji Yeon, who had a reputation for being meticulous and entirely without sentiment, asked several precise questions and then said, Do you want to file this week? I want to be ready, Naomi said. I want everything in order. Given the pregnancy, there are some provisions we should— Whatever protects him, Naomi said. Whatever is best for the baby. That's the only thing that matters right now. Ji Yeon said she understood, and Naomi believed her, because Ji Yeon had a daughter, and the way she said I understand carried the particular weight of someone who was not speaking theoretically. Luca called 14 times in the first 24 hours. She watched the phone screen light up with his name and let it go to voicemail every time. On the 15th call, she picked up. Where are you? He said immediately. Safe. Naomi, I need to know where— I'm safe. The baby is safe, and I'm not telling you where I am. A pause. You can't just— Yes, she said. I can. We need to talk. In person. You can't make decisions about our son over a phone. You made decisions about our son when you chose what to do with your evenings for the last 7 months. She wasn't angry when she said it, just factual. I'm catching up. That's not— He exhaled. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more controlled, more deliberate. The Luca she recognized, the one who thought clearly under pressure. If you file those papers, Naomi, there are implications. For the business arrangements. For custody. For things that are more complicated than you're thinking about right now. She went very still. Is that a threat? She said. It's a fact. Okay, she said. Now I know where we are. She hung up. She sat for a moment, her hand still on the phone. Then she called Jian back. File it, she said. Jian didn't ask what changed. By end of week, she said. On the second day, the photographs got worse. She'd thought the initial spread was the worst of it. The birthday dinner, the Han River backdrop, the 6 images. She'd been wrong, because on the second day, whoever had originally posted them apparently found something more to offer. A video, shot on a phone, slightly shaky, from what looked like a restaurant table. 30 seconds of Luca and Selena Park dancing, slowly, entirely too slowly for the energy of the room around them. His hand on the small of her back, her face turned toward his shoulder. Naomi watched it once. Then she put her phone face down on the hotel desk and didn't pick it up for 6 hours. It wasn't the video itself that was the worst part. The worst part was the comment she accidentally saw before she put the phone down. A Korean phrase she'd learned in her 3rd year in Seoul, something that loosely translated to, "He looks happier with her." 407 people had agreed. She picked up the glass of water on the desk and drank it. She set it down. She pressed her palms flat on the desk surface and breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts and reminded herself, this has nothing to do with the baby. This has nothing to do with who she was before she walked into this marriage. This is the distance between who someone is and who they let themselves become. And she had been walking that distance for a long time now, and she had finally reached the other side. Her phone buzzed. Not Luca this time. A number she didn't recognize. She picked up. "Mrs. Moretti?" said a woman's voice, accented Korean English. Precise. "My name is Selena Park." Every sound in the hotel room seemed to stop. "I think we should meet," Selena said. Naomi's hand tightened on the phone. "Why?" "Because I know things about your husband's business that you're going to need to know." A brief pause. "And because I'm not his girlfriend. I never was. I'm someone he's been using for something much more specific, and I think you deserve to know what that is." The silence stretched between them across the city. "You have 1 hour," Naomi said finally. "Tell me where." The cafe Selena chose was in Apgujeong, neutral territory, public, the kind of place where 2 women meeting for coffee would attract no attention from anyone. Naomi arrived first on purpose. She chose a table where she could see the door. She ordered chamomile tea. She sat with her coat still on. Selena Park was more beautiful in person than in photographs, which Naomi noted with the detached clarity of someone who had placed herself entirely outside the emotional geography of jealousy. She was also, Naomi realized within the first 30 seconds, frightened. Not of Naomi, of something else. She sat down across from her without ordering anything. She set a small envelope on the table between them. "I want you to know," Selena said, "that I didn't know about you until 3 months ago." "I'm not here to assign blame," Naomi said. Selena looked at her with something close to relief. "He told me he was separated. I know that's... What's in the envelope?" Selena pushed it forward. "Financial routing documents, specifically documents showing that several of Luca's international logistics contracts are structured through shell entities that aren't... They're not legal, Mrs. Moretti. What I mean is, he's been moving money through routes that have your name on the consulting agreements." The chamomile tea was in front of Naomi, and she had not touched it. "My name," she said. "The contracts list you as the strategic consultant. The routes run through your professional signature, your methodology, your framework, the one you used in Chicago when you turned around the Harmon Freight Company." Selena's voice was careful, steady. She'd rehearsed this. "He's been using your professional identity as a structural component of something that the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit has been looking at for the past 10 months. The noise of the cafe continued around them. Someone laughed at a table nearby. A barista called out an order. "He built his empire on my framework," Naomi said slowly. "On your framework and your name," Selena said. "Which means if this goes where I think it's going, and I think it's going there soon, your name is on those documents." "Why are you telling me this?" Selena met her eyes. "Because he used me to move the documents through channels that would keep his fingerprints clean. He's been using both of us. I just found out my version of the story a little earlier than you found yours. Naomi picked up the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment. This small, plain thing. Another white envelope. Another contained catastrophe. She had thought, walking out of that apartment, that she had already reached the bottom of what this marriage had been capable of revealing about itself. She had been wrong again. I need you to tell me everything, Naomi said. From the beginning. Selena nodded. I need everything you have, every document, every date, every routing number. I have it, Selena said. All of it. That's why I called you. Outside, Seoul moved at its own relentless pace, indifferent and enormous. Inside the cafe, two women sat across from each other with the ruins of the same man between them, and one of them opened an envelope, and the other one started talking, and the third person in the equation, the one who wasn't in the room, the one who was probably right now in his study making phone calls with controlled efficiency, had absolutely no idea that the most dangerous thing he'd ever done wasn't the affair, wasn't the missed appointment, wasn't 7 months of choices laid bare by a stranger's social media. The most dangerous thing Luca Moretti had ever done was leave brilliant women alone with enough time to compare notes. Naomi listened. She didn't interrupt. She asked 2 precise questions and absorbed the answers and kept her expression completely neutral. Her tea cooled. The cafe buzzed around her, and somewhere inside her, beneath the resolve and the practicality and the 4-count breathing, something cold and clear was beginning to take shape. Not anger, not revenge, nothing so hot or simple as either of those. Something much more permanent. When Selena finished, she leaned forward slightly. What are you going to do? Naomi folded the envelope and put it in her bag. She straightened her coat. She placed both hands flat on the table in a gesture that, if Selena had known her longer, she would have recognized as the specific posture Naomi adopted when she had already made a decision and was simply completing the final calculation before acting on it. I'm going to protect my son, Naomi said. She stood up. And then I'm going to build something that doesn't have his name anywhere on it. She left the cafe without looking back, stepping out into the cold Seoul afternoon with the documents in her bag and the baby pressing steady against her ribs and the clearest head she'd had in 4 years. And she did not once, not for a single moment, look over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching. She was done watching for permission. That night, from the hotel room, she made 3 calls. The first was to Ji-yeon, who listened for 6 minutes without interrupting and then said, in the careful tone of a lawyer who has just discovered the case is significantly larger than the initial filing, I'm going to need to bring in someone else, a financial crime specialist. Do you trust my judgment on who? Completely, Naomi said. The second call was to her former colleague in Chicago, a man named David Yoon, whom she'd worked with before the move to Seoul, who had spent the last 4 years sending her occasional emails asking if she was ready to consult again yet. She'd always said she wasn't. David, she said, I need to talk to you about something. Finally, he said, without any preamble, which was why she'd always liked him. The third call she almost didn't make. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. The hotel room quiet around her, the city lights coming through the curtains in thin lines. She thought about pride. She thought about what it cost and what it was worth. Then she called her mother in Atlanta. Her mother picked up on the second ring. It was afternoon in Atlanta. In the background, Naomi could hear the specific ambient sound of her mother's kitchen, the refrigerator, the television on low. Baby, her mother said, and that single word spoken in that particular voice, which had not changed at all in 40 years, was the thing that finally, quietly, opened something in Naomi that had been sealed shut since she'd sat in the hospital waiting room the morning before with the empty chair beside her. She didn't fall apart. She wasn't that kind of woman, and she wasn't that kind of moment. But she told her mother everything, and her mother listened without interrupting, which was not always her mother's tendency, but was exactly what she understood was needed. And when Naomi finished, there was a brief silence, and then her mother said, When are you coming home? I'm not coming home, Naomi said. I'm going to Busan. Busan. Her mother said it like a word in a foreign language. I have a plan, Naomi said. I have work. I have people who can help. I need to be somewhere he can't. Somewhere that's mine. Another silence. You're sure? I'm sure. And the baby? The baby is fine. The baby is healthy. The baby, Naomi said, with a steadiness that surprised even herself. is going to be raised by someone who actually shows up. Her mother breathed out slowly. All right then, she said, and then, you call me every day. Every day, Naomi said. I mean it, Naomi. Every day. Not every 2 days, not when you remember. I know, Mama. You're the most stubborn woman I have ever met, and I include myself in that assessment. I know. Call me tomorrow. I will. She hung up and lay back on the hotel bed, still in her clothes, hands resting on her stomach, staring at the ceiling. The baby moved. A slow, comfortable roll, like something settling into place. We're going to be okay, she told him. She believed it this time. That was new. That was something the last 48 hours had given her, in exchange for everything they had taken. The specific, unambiguous certainty of a woman who has stopped waiting to see what happens, and has decided instead to be the thing that happens. In 3 days, she would be gone. In 8 weeks, her son would be born. In 6 months, Luca Moretti's empire would begin bleeding in ways he couldn't trace and couldn't stop, because the woman who had been its invisible architecture had removed herself from the structure, and the structure did not yet know it was already falling. But that would come later. Tonight, in a hotel room in Mapo, Naomi Carter pressed her hand against the place where her son was moving and let herself be for exactly 1 more hour, in the space between what her life had been and what it was about to become. Then she sat up, opened her laptop, and began. She'd been in Busan for 11 days when the first letter arrived. Not a message, not an email. An actual letter delivered to the address she hadn't given Luca, which told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly he'd been paying attention even while appearing not to. The envelope was plain white, no return address. Her name written in the particular precise handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship as a form of discipline. She didn't open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen table of the small apartment she'd rented in Hyundai, 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, a window that looked out over a narrow street rather than the ocean, because the ocean view apartments cost twice as much. And she was being careful now, careful in a way she hadn't needed to be in 4 years, counting things, measuring things, rebuilding the particular skill set of a woman who depends on no one's infrastructure but her own. She made tea. She sat down. She opened the letter. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said he had retained legal counsel and that the divorce proceedings as currently filed contained certain irregularities that would need to be addressed before the case could move forward. The second paragraph referenced, without specifics, the financial documents she'd obtained from Selena Park, and strongly suggested that any attempt to use those documents in proceedings would result in complications she was not currently equipped to manage. The third paragraph said he hoped she was well and that he remained open to a private conversation. Naomi read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the folder she'd started. A new folder, Busan folder, which sat in the drawer beside the bed, alongside Ji-yeon's contact information and the notes she'd been building every evening. She called Ji-yeon. I got a letter, she said. We received notice from his legal team this morning as well, Ji-yeon said. She had the voice of someone who had been expecting this and had prepared accordingly. They're moving to contest the financial disclosure requirements. They'll argue the documents Selena Park provided were obtained through irregular means. Were they? That's a complicated question. Uncomplicate it for me. A brief pause. Selena took documents from a shared workspace she had access to as part of an arrangement with Moretti. Whether that access constitutes consent to removal of the documents is something a court will need to decide. His lawyers know this. They're not going to win that argument outright, but they can slow things down considerably. How considerably? Months. Possibly longer, given the financial crimes element. The KFIU investigation has its own timeline, and it doesn't align with the family court timeline, and his team will exploit every gap between them. Naomi looked out the window at the narrow street. A delivery man was parking his motorcycle below. An ordinary Tuesday. What do I need to do? She said. Keep building your independent financial record, Ji-yeon said. Every contract you sign, every invoice you issue, every bank transaction, it all goes in the file. His lawyers are going to argue that you're financially dependent on his infrastructure. We need to disprove that before the baby comes. The baby comes in 6 weeks. I know. A pause that meant something. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Naomi said, which was partially true. She was holding up. She was sleeping, eating, working, breathing. Whether that constituted fine was a definitional question she didn't have time for. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a moment, just breathing. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to build enough of an independent financial record that a court would look at her and see a woman with her own footing, not an extension of a man she was divorcing. 6 weeks. 32 weeks pregnant, in an apartment in a city where she knew almost no one, with a legal case that was about to get significantly more complicated. She opened her laptop. She got to work. The next 2 weeks moved in a particular rhythm that she would remember later as both the hardest and the most clarifying period of her adult life. She woke at 5:30 because sleep beyond that had become physically impossible. She worked until 8. She ate breakfast with the specific joylessness of someone fueling a machine. She worked until noon. She rested for exactly 1 hour. Not because she wanted to, but because Ji-yeon had told her that third trimester stress had measurable effects on fetal development, and Naomi had filed that information in the part of her brain that overrode personal preference. She worked until 6. She called her mother. She reviewed her files. She slept. David Yoon came through faster than she'd expected. He had 2 contracts lined up before she'd finished her first week in Busan. Small but real. A mid-sized Korean freight operation looking for strategic restructuring, and a Singaporean import firm that needed someone to audit their supply chain for inefficiencies. Real work. Work that had her name on it and no one else's. She signed both. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. The particular puzzle of logistics, the way a supply chain is essentially a living system, full of redundancies and pressure points and opportunities that most people can't see because they're looking at the parts rather than the movement between them, had made sense to her since she was 24, working her first real job in Chicago, watching freight companies hemorrhage money in places no one was looking. She had a gift for seeing the whole shape of a system and identifying exactly where the pressure was going wrong. It was the same gift, she understood now, that Luca had built his empire on. She tried not to think about that too much. It led somewhere she wasn't ready to go yet. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, she was in the middle of a call with the Singapore firm when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She ignored it. The call lasted 40 minutes. When she looked at the message afterward, it said, "We need to talk. I found something. Don't contact Luca or Jiyeon before you hear from me. S. Selena." Naomi stared at the message. Then she called the number. Selena picked up on the first ring. Her voice was different from the cafe. Tighter. Less rehearsed. "Where are you?" she said. "Busan. What did you find?" "Not over the phone." A pause. "Can you get to Seoul?" "I'm 34 weeks pregnant, Selena." "I know. I'm sorry. She stopped. There was background noise on her end. Wind, traffic. She was outside, moving. "There's someone who reached out to me. A man named Park Jun-seo. He says he's a former accountant for one of Luca's holding companies. He left 8 months ago, and he's been sitting on information because he was afraid, and then he saw the photographs online, and he..." Another stop. "He has something, Naomi, something that changes the picture significantly." "Changes it how?" "The shell companies that your name is on. The routing structure." Selena's voice dropped. "It wasn't just Luca. There's a third party. Someone who built the whole framework and used both of you as structural cover." Naomi felt something shift in the room without anything actually moving. "Who?" she said. "That's what Park Jun-seo wants to tell you in person. He won't do it over the phone. He says he needs to know the information goes directly to you and not to anyone who might pass it back." "You mean anyone connected to Luca?" "I mean anyone, including your lawyer." Naomi sat very still. "He doesn't trust Ji-yeon. He doesn't trust anyone in Luca's orbit, and right now, from where this man is standing, everyone in your professional circle is in that orbit." She thought about Ji-yeon, smart, methodical, precise Ji-yeon with her daughter and her careful voice. She thought about how Ji-yeon had been recommended to her by a mutual acquaintance in Seoul. She thought about who that acquaintance was, and who that acquaintance knew, and the particular cold clarity of a spider web when you hold it up to the light. "Set up the meeting," she said. She took the KTX to Seoul the next morning, which took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and cost her the kind of physical discomfort that comes with being 34 weeks pregnant in a train seat, and she did not tell Ji-yeon she was going. The meeting was in a coffee shop in Mapo, not far from where she'd stayed in the hotel. Park Jun-seo was in his mid-40s, compact, with the look of a man who had spent years being meticulous and was now living with the consequences of what his meticulousness had shown him. He had a canvas bag on the chair beside him. He was drinking water. He stood up when Naomi and Selena walked in. He looked at Naomi's stomach and then at her face, and then he said, in English that was careful and accented, "Thank you for coming. I'm sorry for the circumstances." "Sit down," Naomi said. "Tell me what you found." He sat. He reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a slim folder. He slid it across the table. "Do you know a man named Henry Cho?" Naomi didn't move. "He's a senior partner at the firm that handles Luca's legitimate business interests. I've met him twice, dinner events. He's also the architect of the shell company network." Park Jun-seo tapped the folder. "In here you'll find documentation showing that Cho built the routing structure 18 months before Luca adopted it. The structure was designed specifically to route liability away from the controlling party and onto the consulting signatures." He met her eyes. "Your signature was written into the framework before you ever signed anything. The contracts you were given to review and sign, they were already structurally embedded in a system that made you the visible face of the operation." The cafe noise continued. Somewhere behind her, a child was laughing. "He set me up," she said. It wasn't a question. "Henry Cho used your professional reputation as a legal buffer. Luca may or may not have known the full extent of it. That's less clear." Park Jun-seo's voice was steady. He'd said this before in his head, probably many times. "What's clear is that when the KFIU investigation reaches its next phase, which I believe is within the next 4 to 6 weeks, your name will appear on documents that make you look like a principal in an illegal logistics operation." Selena was looking at her hands. Naomi opened the folder. She looked at the first page. The second. Her own name, in her own professional signature style, on a document she had never seen before. A contract dated 14 months ago. For a routing operation she had not designed but whose framework was unmistakably hers. The particular architecture of her Chicago methodology, mapped onto something that had nothing to do with legitimate freight. Someone had studied her work thoroughly enough to replicate her professional fingerprint. She turned to the third page and there it was, her actual signature. On a document she did have a memory of signing, a consulting agreement Luca had handed her 8 months ago, telling her it was a routine expansion of their joint professional arrangement. She had read it. She had thought she understood it. She had signed it. "The consulting agreement from last October," she said. "That document served as the authorization anchor for the entire framework," Park Jun-seo said. "Everything before it was preparatory. That signature made it legally binding." She thought about October. 8 months ago, 6 months into the affair. 1 month after she'd first noticed Luca's particular new distance, the specific way a person's attention shifts when it has somewhere else to go. She had been 4 months pregnant. She had been trying, still, to hold the shape of what she thought her life was. He had handed her the document over breakfast. She had been tired. She had skimmed it. She had trusted him. She closed the folder. She looked at Park Jun-seo. "Why are you bringing this to me and not to the authorities?" "I have a wife," he said, "and 2 children. Henry Cho knows where I live." A pause. "I came to you because if this surfaces through you, through legitimate legal channels connected to the divorce proceedings, it disrupts the network without me being the origin point. I need cover, Mrs. Moretti, and you need the truth." It seemed like a reasonable exchange. "That's a very practical position," she said. "I'm a very practical man. What do you want from me specifically?" "I want my name kept out of any court documents for as long as legally possible. And I want the understanding that when it becomes necessary to name me, I'll have time to move my family first." She considered him. "You should know that my lawyer may be compromised." He nodded slowly. "Which is why I didn't want you to involve her before this meeting. I'll need independent legal counsel, someone outside the Seoul network. I'd suggest Busan, or, given your situation, possibly someone international." She thought of David Yoon in Chicago. David Yoon, who had a brother-in-law who was a partner at a firm in New York. David Yoon, who had been asking her to come back for 4 years and would take her call inside of 1 ring. She closed her hand around the folder. "Give me 48 hours, she said. She took the KTX back to Busan that evening. She sat in her seat with one hand on her stomach and the folder in her bag, and she looked out the window at the landscape moving past in the dark, and she thought, with a particular slow thoroughness, about everything she had believed to be true 6 months ago, and what was true now, and what the distance between those two things meant. She had thought she was divorcing a man who had betrayed her. She was actually divorcing a man who, knowingly or not, had participated in framing her. The distinction mattered enormously. She had thought the danger was emotional. Humiliation, loss, the particular grief of a marriage that had died long before anyone admitted it. Those were survivable. She knew how to survive those. She had not accounted for the possibility that she could go to prison. She sat with that thought for a long time. The train moved through the dark. She breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts, and let the thought be what it was instead of trying to manage it away. Then she took out her phone and called David Yoon. He picked up on the second ring. Seoul time was 2 in the afternoon in Chicago. She could hear his office in the background, the mild ambient professionalism of a place where people worked seriously. "David," she said, "I need a lawyer, not Korean, American international financial crimes experience, someone who can operate across jurisdictions." A pause. "Naomi, what happened?" "I'll explain everything, but I need the name first." He didn't ask another question. He said, "Marcus Webb. He's in New York, but he's handled 3 international cases in the last 2 years. I'll send you his number right now." "Don't email it. Call me back with it." Another pause, shorter. He understood. "Give me 4 minutes." He called back in 3. She wrote the number on the inside cover of the folder. She called Marcus Webb at 6 in the evening Busan time, which was 5 in the morning in New York. Because the kind of lawyer who took calls at 5 in the morning from pregnant women in Korea with financial crimes complications was exactly the kind of lawyer she needed. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Webb," he said. His voice was graveled with early morning but completely alert. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said. She didn't say Moretti. "David Yoon gave me your number. I need to talk to you about a situation that has approximately 6 weeks before it becomes unmanageable." "Go ahead," Marcus Webb said. She talked for 22 minutes without interruption. She told him about the consulting agreements, the shell companies, the KFIU investigation timeline, the folder sitting on her lap, Park Jun-seo and Henry Cho, and the signature she'd given Luca over breakfast while she was 4 months pregnant and too tired to read carefully enough. When she finished, Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need to get those documents authenticated independently before you give them to anyone, including me." "I know." "You need to stop all contact with your current Korean counsel until we know her position." "I know that too." "And you need to understand that even with all of that, this is a complicated situation. Complicated in the sense that you have a real exposure problem and a real window to address it, and those two things are in a race with each other." "How do I win the race?" she said. "You move faster than his team expects someone in your situation to move," Webb said. "Pregnant, emotionally compromised, in a foreign country. They expect you to be slow. They're counting on it." "They don't know me very well." "No," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "They clearly don't." She arranged a video call for that afternoon. She spent the next 3 hours going through the folder document by document, building notes in the margins in her own handwriting, the way she'd always organized complex information, not digitally, where it could be accessed or altered, but on paper, in her specific shorthand that no one else had ever been able to read. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang. Ji Yeon. She looked at the screen. She thought about what Park Jun-seo had said. She thought about the mutual acquaintance who had recommended Ji Yeon. She thought about all the ways trust could be constructed to look exactly like trust. She answered. "Naomi," Ji Yeon said, "Luca's team has filed a motion for emergency custody provisions. Given the proximity of the birth, they're arguing that the current living situation constitutes an unstable environment for the child." Everything in the room went sharp and cold. "On what grounds?" Naomi said. "Financial instability. Specifically, they've submitted documentation suggesting that you are the subject of a preliminary KFIU inquiry." A pause. "Naomi, I have to ask you directly, were you aware of any irregularities in the consulting agreements you signed through Luca's company?" There it was. Naomi looked at the folder on the table, at her own name in her own handwriting on documents she hadn't written, at the particular shape of a trap, that had been built around her so slowly and so thoroughly that she'd been living inside it without ever seeing the walls. Ji Yeon, she said carefully. Who told Luca's legal team about the KFIU inquiry? Silence. 3 seconds. 4. That information would have been Ji Yeon. Her voice was perfectly flat. I asked you a direct question. The inquiry is part of the public. The specific details about the consulting agreements aren't public, Naomi said. The specific language in their motion matches information I shared with you in a privileged conversation. She paused. Who are you working for? The silence this time lasted long enough that it was its own answer. I think we need to, Ji Yeon started. We're done, Naomi said. Don't contact me again. Don't contact my son's father on my behalf. Don't file anything under my name. We are done as of this call. She hung up. She sat very still. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Busan went about its afternoon. She could hear faint street noise. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Ji Yeon. Who had the financial documents? Who had every legal filing? Who knew where she was staying because Naomi had given her the address for correspondence? She stood up. She went to the bedroom and pulled her suitcase from under the bed. She began, methodically and without rushing because rushing made errors, packing what she needed. Documents first, then the essentials. She was practiced at this now. 2 suitcases, 32 weeks, and now 36, and she was practiced at starting over. Her phone rang again. Number she didn't recognize. She answered because she'd stopped ignoring unknown numbers. Mrs. Moretti. Male voice, Korean, professional. My name is Agent Shin from the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit. We'd like to schedule a voluntary interview regarding certain consulting agreements associated with Moretti Group. Given your current, a deliberate pause, situation, we can make arrangements to come to you. She looked at the half-packed suitcase on the bed. When, she said, at your earliest convenience, we'd suggest within the next 10 days. 10 days before the KFIU. 6 weeks before the birth. Ji Yeon's information in Luca's lawyer's hands. Park Jun-seo hiding in his apartment waiting for her to build him cover. Marcus Webb in New York. Her son pressing against her ribs with the steady, insistent force of someone who intended to arrive on schedule regardless of what was happening outside. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 years ago. The one who'd followed a man to a foreign country and gradually stopped being primarily herself. The one who'd signed a document over breakfast without reading it carefully enough because she was tired and pregnant, and still, in spite of everything, operating from the assumption that the person across the table from her was on her side. That woman would have been afraid right now. Naomi put the phone on speaker, set it on the nightstand, and kept packing. I'll need to consult with my legal counsel before scheduling any interview, she said. My counsel is Marcus Webb, of Webb and Associates in New York. Please direct all correspondence to his office. She gave the number from the folder cover. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any legitimate inquiry. I want that noted clearly. Noted, Agent Shin said. We'll be in touch. She ended the call. She closed the suitcase. She put on her coat. She picked up the folder. She picked up her bag. She stood in the small apartment in Busan for a moment. The apartment that had been a temporary harbor, that she'd thought might become something more permanent, that had now served its purpose and needed to be left behind. She took one slow breath. The woman she was going to have to become, the one who could survive what was coming, who could build a defense out of incomplete documents and a compromised legal history and an international investigation and a 36-week pregnancy while her husband's lawyers argued she was an unfit mother. That woman had not yet fully arrived. But she was coming. Naomi could feel her somewhere in the space behind the fear, behind the exhaustion, behind the specific grief of learning that the floor you trusted had been hollow all along. She walked out of the apartment, pulled the door closed behind her, and went to find out what she was actually made of. She was in a taxi heading to the KTX station when her water broke. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies, with a gasp and a sudden flood. It was quieter than that. A slow, certain warmth that she felt before she understood what it was. And then she understood, and she sat very still in the back of the cab with her suitcase in the trunk and the folder on her lap, and said to the driver, in Korean that was precise despite everything, "Change of plans, Busan University Hospital. Please drive quickly." He looked at her in the rearview mirror. He drove quickly. She called Marcus Webb from the taxi. It was 4 in the morning in New York. He picked up on the second ring, which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of lawyer he was. "My son is coming," she said. 36 weeks. "I'm going to the hospital now." A pause of exactly 1 second. "Is anyone with you?" "No." "Is there anyone I should contact?" She thought about her mother in Atlanta. She thought about David Yoon in Chicago. She thought about Luca in Seoul, in the apartment she'd left, standing in rooms she'd cleaned and decorated and made livable, holding an ultrasound photo she'd placed beside his dinner plate. "My mother," she said. "Her name is Gloria Carter. I'll text you the number." "I'll handle it," Webb said. "Naomi, listen to me. Everything else waits. The documents are safe, the timeline is manageable. None of it matters right now. Do you understand?" She pressed her hand against her stomach. The taxi was moving fast through Busan streets that were still half dark, the city not yet fully awake, streetlights making orange pools on wet pavement. "I understand," she said. "Call me when it's over." She hung up. She texted her mother's number to Webb. Then she put the phone in her bag and held the folder against her chest with both arms and breathed, deliberately, the way she'd been practicing, in for 4, out for 4, and watched the city slide past the window. Elijah Carter was born at 6:47 in the morning after 9 hours of labor that Naomi endured almost entirely alone, with a Korean nurse named Yuna who held her hand during the worst of it and spoke to her in a mixture of Korean and English, and once, briefly, what sounded like French, and who had a calm, matter-of-fact competence that Naomi would think about for years afterward as the specific quality of grace that shows up in ordinary people during extraordinary moments. She did not call Luca. He found out through his lawyer, who found out through the hospital's legal notification process because his name was on the original pregnancy documentation. By the time he called, Elijah was 4 hours old, wrapped in a hospital blanket, sleeping on Naomi's chest with the absolute unconscious authority of someone who had just completed an enormous journey and intended to rest. She let the call go to voicemail. She lay in the hospital bed with her son and looked at his face. The small, squashed, remarkable face of a person who had no idea what he'd been born into. And she felt something she didn't have a word for. Not joy exactly, or not only joy. Something more complicated. Something that had grief inside it, and resolve inside it, and a love so physical it felt like a structural change, like something in her had rearranged itself at the cellular level to accommodate this new and total priority. "Hi," she said quietly. To him. Her first word to him, outside her body. He didn't open his eyes. He shifted slightly against her chest. "I've got you," she said. "That's the whole plan. That's all of it." Her mother arrived 31 hours later, having taken the first available flight from Atlanta to Incheon, and then the KTX to Busan, arriving at the hospital with a rolling suitcase and a look on her face that managed to be simultaneously devastated and completely furious and absolutely present, which was the particular combination that Gloria Carter had specialized in for 63 years. She walked into the hospital room, looked at Naomi, looked at the baby, and sat down in the chair beside the bed without saying anything at all for a long moment. Then she said, "He looks like your grandfather." "I know," Naomi said, "around the eyes." "I know, Mama." Gloria reached out and put one finger against Elijah's fist, which was curled beside his face. The fist opened slightly, the way newborn fists do, instinctive and complete. "All right," Gloria said. She sat back. She looked at her daughter. "Tell me everything that's happened since the last time we talked," Naomi told her. "All of it. Ji Yeon, Henry Cho, Park Jun-seo, Marcus Webb, the KFIU, the custody motion." Gloria listened the way she always listened when the situation was serious, completely still, eyes on her daughter's face, not interrupting. When Naomi finished, Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm staying." "Mama, you don't have to." "I didn't say I had to. I said I'm staying." She crossed her arms. "Who else is helping you?" "Marcus Webb, David Yoon, and—" She paused. "A woman named Selena Park." Gloria's expression shifted precisely 1 millimeter. "The other woman." "She's not. It's complicated." "I'm 63 years old, Naomi. Uncomplicated." "She was being used by the same people who were using me. She came to me first. She's been useful." Gloria looked at her for a long moment. And you trust her? I trust that her interests align with mine right now. Naomi shifted Elijah slightly. That's enough. Gloria nodded, which was the closest she came to saying, that's actually a sophisticated position, and I respect it. 3 days after Elijah's birth, Naomi received a court document at the hospital. Luca's legal team had moved fast. The emergency custody motion had been granted a preliminary hearing date set for 3 weeks out. The motion argued, in precise legal language, that Naomi's current circumstances, no permanent residence, pending financial investigation, estranged from primary social support network, made her an unstable primary caregiver. She read it in the hospital bed while Elijah slept in the bassinet beside her. Then she handed it to her mother, who read it and set it down on the tray table with the specific controlled care of a woman preventing herself from doing something decisive with it. Call your lawyer, Gloria said. Already texted him. Naomi was typing one-handed, Elijah's hand wrapped around her index finger. Webb's filing a counter motion today. He's also in contact with the KFIU. He's negotiating the interview terms so that any statements I make are protected from the family court proceedings. Can he do that? He says he's done it twice before. Gloria looked at her daughter. How are you paying for this? Singapore contract, and David lined up a third client yesterday, a Japanese logistics firm that needs a full supply chain audit. She looked up from her phone. I'm good at this, Mama. I've always been good at this. She stopped. Stop doing it, Gloria said. I stopped doing it. For a man. For a man. Gloria said nothing for a moment, then, well, you've started again. Naomi looked at her son. Yes, she said. I have. She left the hospital on day 4 because the room cost money and she was watching every number now. She and Gloria moved into a larger apartment in Hyundai. 2 bedrooms, proper kitchen, the kind of place that could sustain 2 adults and a newborn for several months. She paid 3 months up front from the Singapore contract payment, which left her with enough to operate carefully but not to make mistakes. She did not make mistakes. In the 10 days between leaving the hospital and the preliminary custody hearing, she worked 6 hours a day while Elijah slept, and her mother watched him, and she built the financial record Ji-yeon had told her to build before Ji-yeon turned out to be working against her. She had Marcus Webb verify every document. She had David Yoon's assistant cross-reference every transaction. She maintained a paper trail so thorough and so precise that it would have satisfied the most skeptical auditor, because that was exactly who she was building it for. On the 8th day, Henry Cho made a mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind of mistake that meticulous people make when they're certain the other party is too compromised to notice. He filed an amended legal document on behalf of Luca's holding company that contained a routing reference, a single embedded code in the document metadata, that directly connected to one of the shell company structures in Park Jun-seo's folder. Naomi noticed. She sent the document to Webb at 11 at night, Busan time. Webb called back at midnight. Where did you find this, he said. Public court filing, amended financial disclosure in support of the custody motion. He filed this himself. Webb's voice had changed, not louder, sharper. He filed this himself through the family court, which makes it a public document, which means the KFIU can access it without a warrant. I know, Naomi said. A pause. Naomi, this is significant. I know that too. This is the link we needed between the shell structure and someone in Luca's visible legal team. This takes it from you being a name on documents to there being a clearly culpable third party with their hands in the system. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Elijah asleep in the next room and her mother's quiet breathing audible through the wall and the folder open in front of her, her own handwriting in the margins. All the pieces that had been accumulating for weeks now, arranged in the particular order of a structure that was finally showing its complete shape. Send it to Agent Shin, she said. Tonight. You're sure? Send it tonight, before anyone realizes what was filed and tries to amend it. Webb sent it. At 2 a.m, Seoul time, the KFIU opened a formal inquiry into Henry Cho's professional conduct. By 8 a.m, Luca's legal team had gone very quiet. The preliminary custody hearing was in Seoul Family Court on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Elijah's birth. Naomi took the KTX with her mother, who held Elijah for the entire journey with the focused possessiveness of a grandmother who had just arrived and intended to make her presence structurally significant. The courtroom was smaller than Naomi had expected. Fluorescent light, wood paneling, the particular atmosphere of a room where ordinary people's worst days got processed into administrative language. Luca was already there when she arrived, with 2 lawyers and a man she didn't recognize who had the specific look of a forensic accountant. Luca was in a dark suit. He looked like himself, controlled, contained, present in the room the way powerful men are present, with a quality of attention that seemed to reduce everything around them. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She sat down at her table. Marcus Webb was on video from New York, his feed on a laptop that a Korean associate held steady at the table. It wasn't ideal. It was what she had, and she'd learned in the last 3 weeks to work with what she had and not waste energy mourning what she didn't. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible marital disaster and had been moved to neither surprise nor excessive sympathy by any of them. Her name was Judge Park Hyun-jo. Naomi had researched her. She had a reputation for precision and for an almost aggressive prioritization of documented fact over emotional testimony. Good, Naomi had thought when she read that. Good. The hearing began. Luca's lead attorney, a sharp man named Bae, who specialized in high-asset family cases, opened with a statement about the instability of Naomi's current circumstances. The hotel stay, the apartment change, the distance from Seoul's medical infrastructure, the pending financial investigation. Then Webb spoke, through the laptop screen, in the level, impeccably organized manner of someone who had spent weeks building toward exactly this moment. He submitted the financial record, 12 days of documented income, signed contracts, bank statements, the Singapore payment. He submitted letters from David Yoon and from the Singapore and Japanese firms confirming active professional relationships. He submitted documentation of the KFIU's updated inquiry status, which now listed Henry Cho as a person of interest and explicitly noted that Naomi Carter was cooperating with investigators and was not a subject of the inquiry. Attorney Bae objected to the KFIU documentation. Judge Park looked at it over her glasses for a long moment and then said, in Korean, that the associate translated in a low voice, "The documentation appears to be in order. The objection is noted and overruled." Luca's hands on the table in front of him were perfectly still. Naomi watched them. She'd always watched his hands. In 4 years of marriage, she had learned that his hands were the only part of him that showed what he was actually feeling. Not dramatically, not with visible tremors, but in a very small way, in the particular tension of his knuckles when something had landed differently than he expected. His knuckles were white. Then Bae made his second argument, which Naomi had been waiting for and had prepared for, and which landed anyway with the specific impact of something that's been aimed directly at the place you can least afford to be hit. The child is currently in a 1-bedroom apartment, Bae said, being cared for by a woman who, 9 days ago, underwent an extended labor without medical advocacy or family support present. The child's father has a permanent residence, established medical resources, and financial stability that is not currently under any formal inquiry. He paused. We are not disputing Mrs. Moretti's competence as a mother. We are questioning whether the current environment is optimal for a child born 3 weeks premature. Judge Park looked at Naomi's table. Webb spoke, carefully. He was good. He addressed every point. The apartment was 2 bedrooms now. The grandmother was present. The premature birth had been managed without complication, and the child was medically cleared. But Naomi could hear, in the slight shift of his cadence, the place where the argument was thinner than they wanted it to be. Elijah was 9 days old. Naomi had moved twice in 3 weeks. The history was real, even if the present was stable. Judge Park made a note. She said the hearing would recess for 30 minutes. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Naomi stood with her mother, who had Elijah in a carrier against her chest, and Webb's associate, and she drank a small bottle of water in 3 long swallows and tried to read the morning accurately. How did that go? She asked the associate. He was honest, which she appreciated. The KFIU update was strong. The financial documentation was strong. The residential history is a problem. Judge Park is going to want reassurance about stability. What kind of reassurance? Ideally, a permanent address. Seoul would be better than Busan. It removes the argument about medical infrastructure. I'm not moving back to Seoul. I understand, but I'm not moving back to Seoul, she said again. Not with heat, just as a fact that had been decided and did not require revisiting. The associate nodded and went to call Webb. Gloria shifted Elijah in the carrier and looked at her daughter. You need to eat something. I'm not hungry. That wasn't a question. She pulled a wrapped piece of cornbread from her bag with the particular matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had arrived from Atlanta, prepared for exactly this kind of logistical contingency. Eat. Naomi ate the cornbread standing in a Korean courthouse corridor and thought about permanent addresses and stability, and the specific cruelty of a system that could look at a woman who had held herself together through betrayal and investigation and 36-week labor and a compromised lawyer and still take her to court 9 days later and ask whether she was stable enough. Luca came out of the courtroom. He came directly toward her, which she didn't expect. His lawyers were behind him, visibly uncertain about this decision. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her, and then at his mother-in-law, and then, for a long and particular moment, at the infant carrier on Gloria's chest, at Elijah. Naomi watched him look at his son for the first time. She'd thought she'd prepared for this moment. She hadn't, quite, because whatever she'd expected to feel watching it, satisfaction, grief, anger, something, what she actually felt was something more complicated and less useful. The particular ache of a thing that should have been different, the specific sorrow of watching a man encounter a consequence of his own making and see it clearly too late. Luca's face did something she'd never seen it do. Not in court, not in 4 years of marriage. It cracked, in the small, precise way that very controlled faces crack. Not into weeping, not into anything so exposed as that, but into something real. Something that had bypassed the walls entirely and arrived without permission. He's small, Luca said. His voice was wrong. Stripped again, like the morning after the divorce papers, but worse now. Rawer. He's healthy, Naomi said. He's perfect. He looked at her. I want to see him. Your lawyers can talk to mine about a schedule. Naomi. He took half a step forward. His lead attorney reached for his arm and he shook it off without looking back. I'm not here to fight you. I need you to know that. The motion, it was, I filed it. I told him to protect our son. I didn't. I should have read what he was doing more carefully. You should have read a lot of things more carefully, she said. He accepted that. She watched him accept it. Not argue it, not deflect it, just take it into himself and stand with it. I know. He looked down briefly, looked back up. I didn't know what Cho was doing with the documents, with your signature. Did you ask? A pause. I trusted him. I trusted you, she said. And I signed a document over breakfast at 4 months pregnant because you handed it to me and told me it was routine. So I understand how trust works. I understand how it gets used. He said nothing for a moment. In the corridor around them, people moved. Lawyers, clerks, a couple arguing quietly near the water fountain. Ordinary court day. Ordinary human disasters, all in a row. What do you want? He said. Not negotiating, asking. I want my son to grow up knowing his father, she said. On a schedule that works for a child, not for your legal team. I want my name removed from every document in the Cho structure. I want the KFIU to have everything they need to close the inquiry without my name attached to the outcome. She paused. And I want you to stop the custody motion. If you stop the motion and give me what I've just listed, we can work out something reasonable about Elijah. Reasonable. Not what your lawyers think is strategic, what is actually good for a child. He looked at her for a long moment. You've become, he started, and then stopped. What? Harder, he said. And it wasn't an insult. It was an observation. And underneath it, she could hear the specific recognition of a man who understood hardness, because he'd spent his whole life cultivating it, and was now seeing it in someone else and understanding, perhaps for the first time, what he'd been up against without knowing. No, she said. I've been this person the whole time. You just weren't paying attention. She turned back toward the courtroom door. Naomi. His voice stopped her. She didn't turn around. I'm sorry about the appointment. She stood still. Behind her, she heard him breathe. Not about what you know about, he said. Not the photographs, not Selena, not Cho. I'm sorry about the appointment, the hospital, the heartbeat. He paused. That was the one. That was the one I should have... Yes, she said quietly. It was. She went back inside. The recess ended. Judge Park returned. She reviewed the additional documentation Webb had submitted during the break. A proposed co-parenting schedule, a letter from the Busan hospital confirming Elijah's health and discharge status, a signed lease for the two-bedroom apartment. Then Luca's lead attorney Bays stood and said, in a tone that communicated clearly that this had not been his preference, the petitioner withdraws the emergency custody motion at this time. Judge Park looked over her glasses. Withdrawn. Withdrawn, Bay repeated. In the back of Naomi's mind, a door closed, quietly, without drama. The hearing adjourned. Webb's associate shook her hand. Gloria was already talking quietly to Elijah in the carrier, narrating the courtroom in a low voice as though he was following along, which Naomi chose to believe he was. Outside the courthouse, Seoul was doing what Seoul did, moving at its particular relentless pace, enormous and indifferent and full of ordinary lives in extraordinary proximity. The sun was out for the first time in a week. Naomi stood on the courthouse steps and tilted her face toward it for exactly 1 moment, eyes closed. She thought about what Marcus Webb had said on the phone 3 weeks ago, from New York, at 5 in the morning. They're counting on you being slow. She hadn't been slow. She thought about what came next. The KFIU investigation would continue. She would cooperate fully, and Webb was confident the cooperation combined with the Cho documentation would be enough to establish her as a witness rather than a subject. The divorce proceedings would be long and complicated and expensive, and she would get through them the same way she'd gotten through the last 3 weeks, one precise, documented, irrefutable step at a time. She thought about her Singapore contract, the Japanese audit, the email from David Yoon she hadn't had time to answer yet, about a 4th potential client. She thought about Elijah, asleep against her mother's chest, with no idea that today had happened. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown Seoul number she'd learned to recognize over the past 2 weeks. Park Junseo. KFIU served papers to Cho this morning. His lawyer called me 1 hour ago. He's going to try to cooperate before I do. We need to move. She looked at the message. She typed back. Call Webb directly. Now. Give him everything. She put the phone in her bag. She went down the courthouse steps to where her mother was waiting, and she took her son from the carrier, and she held him properly for the first time outside a hospital room, standing on a public sidewalk in Seoul in November sunlight, with everything in front of her and nothing of value behind her. And she felt the specific weight of him, the warmth, the absolute present tense realness of a person who had not yet learned to be afraid of anything. Okay, she said softly. To him. To the day. To the version of herself that had walked out of an apartment in Hanam-dong 40 days ago with 2 suitcases and 1 decision. Okay, let's go. Gloria fell into step beside her. What now? We go back to Busan, Naomi said. I have a call with the Singapore team at 4. And tomorrow? Tomorrow Webb files the counter-discovery motion. She shifted Elijah against her shoulder. And I start writing the proposal for the Japanese audit. You're going to work tonight, the night after a custody hearing. I'm going to work tonight, Naomi confirmed. Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then, in the particular voice she used when she was profoundly proud of something and was managing not to show it too obviously, you know your father would have... I know, Mama. He would have been... I know. She put her free hand briefly on her mother's arm. I know. They walked to the car through the November Seoul afternoon, and behind them the courthouse stood doing what courthouses do, processing human wreckage into administrative language. And in front of them the city opened up in all its impossible indifferent enormity, and Naomi Carter, not Moretti, she had already begun the paperwork, walked into it with her son and her mother and a phone full of work, and the very particular posture of a woman who had come to the end of being careful and was now simply, she was being precise. That was the word that stayed with her in the months that followed. Not strong, not brave, not resilient, all the words people would eventually use about her in profiles and interviews, and the particular language that gets applied to women who survive things publicly. Precise. She had learned, in the wreckage of the last 6 weeks, That precision was the only tool that didn't break under pressure. Emotion broke. Plans broke. Trust broke. But a woman who was precise, who moved through each hour with the specific documented intentionality of someone who understood that every step was evidence, that woman was very difficult to destroy. She worked on the train back to Busan. Elijah slept against her mother's shoulder, and Naomi had her laptop open and was drafting the Japanese audit proposal, building it from the foundational framework she'd developed in Chicago 12 years ago, the one that Luca's empire had apparently been running on without her name on the door. She was putting her name on the door now. Every document, every proposal, every invoice, Carter Logistics Consulting, registered in Busan, March of the year her son was born. Her mother fell asleep somewhere outside Daegu. Gloria Carter, who had flown from Atlanta to Busan on 30 hours' notice, and had not once in 4 weeks mentioned the cost of the flight or the disruption to her life, slept with the particular total commitment of a woman who had allocated herself completely and was now briefly offline for maintenance. Naomi looked at her mother's face, the lines of it, the familiar geography, and felt something move through her that was not quite any named feeling, but was close to gratitude in the way that deep water is close to the surface. She turned back to the laptop. She finished the proposal. She sent it to David Yoon for review. She closed the laptop and looked out the window at the dark Korean landscape and let herself be, for the remaining hour of the journey, simply a woman on a train with her sleeping family, moving towards something she hadn't named yet but was beginning to see the outline of. Henry Cho was arrested on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the custody hearing. Naomi found out from Marcus Webb, who called at 7 in the morning, Busan time, with the particular contained satisfaction of a lawyer who has been working towards something for a long time and has just watched it arrive. The KFIU had moved on 3 of Cho's shell companies simultaneously, which suggested they had documentation beyond what Park Jun-seo had provided, which suggested someone inside Cho's operation had also decided that cooperation was preferable to exposure. "Your name has been formally removed from the investigation," Webb said. "You'll receive written confirmation by end of week. The KFIU may still want a final interview. Voluntary. No legal jeopardy attached." "I'll do it," Naomi said immediately. "I'll schedule it." A pause. "Naomi, this is over. The investigation piece of it. It's over." She was in the kitchen. Elijah was in the next room, in the bouncy seat her mother had found at a second-hand shop in Haeundae, making the small inquisitive sounds he'd recently developed, a kind of vocal experimentation that Gloria had described as him conducting research on what noises humans responded to. Naomi leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at the wall. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," Webb said. "I want you to know that. The Cho document, the amended filing, the way you moved in the 48 hours before the hearing, that's what got us here. Not me." "Send me your invoice," she said. He laughed, which was the first time she'd heard him laugh. It was a good laugh, genuine, brief, the laugh of a man who spent most of his working life in very serious rooms and appreciated when something landed cleanly. She went to the next room and picked up her son and held him against her shoulder and stood at the window and looked out at the Busan street, the ordinary, unheroic, completely adequate street of her ordinary life, and felt something in her chest ease finally, in a way that she realized had been braced against releasing for months. "It's done," she told Elijah. He grabbed a fistful of her shirt and pulled it toward his mouth with the single-minded focus of a person who had not yet learned that not everything in reach was food. "Well, that part is done." The divorce was finalized 8 months later. It was not clean. No divorce involving a man of Luca's financial complexity was going to be clean, and Naomi had known that going in and had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything now, thoroughly, without illusion, with her eyes on the actual terrain rather than the terrain she wished she was navigating. There were depositions and counterfilings and a 3-day mediation session in Seoul that left her exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix, the bone-deep exhaustion of sustained, careful performance in a room with people who were working against her. But Webb was good, and she had built her financial record, and the KFIU inquiry had done something Luca's lawyers hadn't anticipated. It had removed his structural advantage, because a man whose legal infrastructure has just been partially dismantled by a financial crimes investigation has fewer levers to pull in family court than he expected. The settlement gave her full primary custody of Elijah, with generous structured visitation for Luca. It gave her a financial arrangement that was, if not what she'd been entitled to as the silent architect of his empire, at least enough to operate. It gave her complete severance from every consulting agreement connected to Moretti Group, with a formal legal finding that her professional signature had been used without full informed consent, a finding that took 7 months to secure and that Webb said he'd never seen achieved so cleanly in a comparable case. She signed the final papers in a conference room in Busan on a Thursday afternoon in November, almost exactly 1 year after the morning she'd woken before sunrise with one quiet hope and found a 2-line text on her phone instead. She signed her name, Naomi Carter, no hyphen. She drove home to find her mother in the kitchen, making the red sauce she'd learned from Naomi's recipe. The one Naomi had learned from Luca's mother, which felt like a strange inheritance but was also, undeniably, a very good sauce. While Elijah sat in his high chair dismantling a piece of bread with the methodical intensity of a very young engineer. Gloria looked up when she came in. "Done?" she said. "Done," Naomi said. Her mother nodded once. She went back to the sauce. Naomi sat down across from her son and watched him work on the bread and thought, this is what it was for. All of it. Every document and every phone call at 5 in the morning, and every night she worked until midnight, because the alternative was sitting still long enough to feel how frightened she was. This kitchen. This child. This ordinary, sufficient, entirely hers life. Luca came to collect Elijah for his first overnight visit on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. He arrived on time, which she noted without comment. He was in civilian clothes, no suit, dark jeans, and a coat she didn't recognize, which made him look slightly like a different version of himself. Someone she might have met at a party before she knew who he was. Naomi had Elijah ready. The bag was packed with the particular thoroughness of a woman who has learned that other people's competence cannot be assumed. Diapers, formula, the specific brand of wet wipes that didn't irritate his skin, the lamb-shaped rattle he couldn't sleep without. Written instructions for the bedtime routine in both English and Korean because she was taking no chances. She opened the door and he was standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, which was not a Luca Moretti posture. Luca Moretti didn't put his hands in his pockets. He occupied space with deliberate authority. This man standing at her door looked like someone who was trying to take up less of it. He looked at Elijah, who was on her hip, staring at him with the frank and total evaluation of an 11-month-old encountering a recurring but not yet categorized figure. "Hi," Luca said to him, quietly, like he was trying not to startle something. Elijah looked at him for a moment. Then he reached out one hand toward Luca's face with the proprietary curiosity that was his primary mode of engaging with the world. Something happened in Luca's expression. Something Naomi looked away from because it wasn't hers to witness. She handed Luca the packed bag and the written instructions. She went through the essentials without meeting his eyes. Bedtime is 7:30. He'll tell you when he's tired by pulling his own ear. The lamb rattle has to be in the crib, not on the floor. The emergency contact is my mother's number, which is in the instructions. Luca listened. He didn't interrupt. He asked one question, about the formula temperature, and she answered it. Then there was a pause. "Naomi," he said. "The instructions are thorough," she said. "Call me if anything changes." "I know." He adjusted the bag on his shoulder. He looked at her, finally, directly. "I wanted to tell you that Selena, I know you know she's the reason the Cho documentation surfaced. I know that without her coming to you, the investigation would have—" "I know what would have happened," Naomi said. "I wanted to say that I understand it now, what I built. How I built it." He paused. "And on whose back?" She looked at him. There was a particular speech she could have given at this moment. She had the material for it. God knew she had the material. 4 years of it stacked and documented and formally entered into the legal record. She didn't give it. "Take good care of him this weekend," she said instead. He nodded. He looked down at Elijah, who was now investigating the zipper on Luca's coat with great professional interest. Something moved through Luca's face again. The thing she looked away from. "He has your hands," Luca said. "The shape of them." She looked at Elijah's hands, small, precise, currently gripping the zipper with considerable determination. "Bring him back Sunday at 6, she said. He brought him back Sunday at 5:47, which was close enough. Elijah was clean, fed, and wearing a new onesie that she hadn't packed. Dark blue, soft, the kind of thing someone buys when they're in a shop and see it and think of someone specific. She didn't comment on the onesie. She took her son and felt the specific gravity of him settle back against her shoulder, the familiar weight of him, and felt something release that she hadn't known was held. Same weekend next month? Luca asked from the doorway. Talk to Webb's office, she said. They have the schedule. He nodded. He started to turn. Then, he laughed yesterday, properly. I was making a face and he laughed. She looked at her son's face. He does that, she said. He's been doing it for 3 weeks. A silence. Not hostile. Just the silence of two people who are no longer on the same side of a door they used to share. Thank you for letting me have him this weekend, Luca said. She didn't say, I didn't let you. The court established it. She didn't say, don't thank me for basic co-parenting. She said because it was true, and because truth was the only economy she was operating in anymore. He needs to know you. Luca left. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with Elijah and let the apartment settle back into its shape around her. Her books on the shelf, her work on the kitchen table, her mother's coat on the hook by the door, the particular smell of the space that was entirely theirs. Okay, she said to Elijah. He grabbed her ear. 2 years after leaving Hanamdong, Naomi Carter presented the completed Japanese logistics audit to a board of directors in Tokyo and was offered a contract that was 4 times the size of anything she'd signed before. She negotiated it herself, with Webb on the phone for the legal terms, and she signed it in a conference room on the 38th floor with Mount Fuji visible through the window on a clear day, which she registered as a coincidence and nothing more. On the flight back to Busan, she worked for 2 hours and then closed the laptop and looked out the window at the clouds and let herself feel it, not triumphantly, not with any sense of narrative completion, because life wasn't that clean. She felt it the way she felt most things now, directly, without performance, with the specific quiet satisfaction of a woman who has done something difficult and knows it and doesn't need anyone else to confirm it. Carter Logistics Consulting moved to Seoul the following spring. A proper office, 3 employees, 2 major ongoing contracts, and 4 in negotiation. She chose a building in Seongdong-gu, far from Hanamdong, with a view of a park rather than the river. She spent 1 afternoon furnishing it and then let her team handle the rest because she had work to do and she'd learned, finally, to stop doing everything herself. Her mother went back to Atlanta. The goodbye was at Incheon, Elijah on Naomi's hip, Gloria in her good coat with her rolling suitcase, and they stood in the departures hall and looked at each other, and her mother said, You're going to be fine. I know, Mama. I'm not saying it because I need to reassure you. I'm saying it because it's already true. Gloria cupped Naomi's face in both hands briefly, the gesture she'd been making since Naomi was 7 years old, and it had never once meant anything other than, I see you exactly. It's already true. She flew away. Naomi drove back to Seoul and went to the office and worked until 7, and then collected Elijah from the daycare attached to the building and took him home and made dinner and bathed him and read to him and put him down and then sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and felt the shape of her life as it actually was. Imperfect, demanding, occasionally frightening, and completely, irrevocably hers. Gabriel Okoye came into her life on a Tuesday, which was appropriate because nothing important had ever happened to Naomi on a day with more poetic ambition. He was a contact David Yoon had connected her with, a London-based investor with interests in African logistics infrastructure, looking for a consulting partner with experience in Asian supply chain networks. David had sent her his email with a note that said, He's smart, and he's not an idiot about how he uses his intelligence, which makes him unusual. She'd had 4 professional meetings with Gabriel over 3 months before she noticed that she looked forward to them. She noticed this the way she noticed most things now, directly, without drama, as a data point that required acknowledgement before it could be properly evaluated. He was not like Luca. That was the first thing she'd registered, and the thing she kept returning to, not because she was comparing, she was done comparing. Comparison was a tax on the present she could no longer afford, but because the difference was instructive. Gabriel Okoye occupied space differently. He listened before he spoke, not as a technique, but as a genuine preference. He asked questions that were interesting because he was actually interested in the answers. He did not, in their first 6 months of professional acquaintance, say a single thing that she needed to translate from what it appeared to be into what it actually was. She found that disorienting for several weeks. She'd become very good at translation. He met Elijah at a working lunch where the daycare had a closure, and she'd had no alternative but to bring him. And she'd watched Gabriel interact with a 14-month-old with the specific attention of a man who didn't perform engagement with children, but also didn't find them disruptive, who simply adjusted to the reality of the room as it actually was. Elijah, who was a precise judge of character in the way that pre-verbal children are, having not yet developed the capacity for social performance, spent 20 minutes ignoring Gabriel entirely, then climbed onto his lap with no warning and fell asleep there, which Naomi noted and did not comment on. Gabriel looked down at the sleeping child on his lap, and then up at her with an expression that was somewhere between alarmed and moved, and said, "Should I not move?" "He'll wake up if you do," she said. "Then I won't move." He sat there for 40 minutes without moving. They continued the meeting. He signed a preliminary agreement for the consulting partnership with Elijah, asleep on his lap, which was not the way she'd planned that meeting, and also, in some way she couldn't immediately articulate, was exactly right. She did not rush anything. She was constitutionally incapable of rushing anything now. The last years had burned that habit out of her so thoroughly that impatience felt like a foreign language. She moved through the development of what she and Gabriel were to each other with the same precision she brought to everything, observing, documenting in the private record of her own attention, making no moves that weren't supported by evidence. He came to Seoul for work twice in the following 6 months. She had dinner with him both times. The second time, at a restaurant in Seongdong-gu that had no particular ambiance beyond good food and tables spaced far enough apart for a real conversation, he said, "I want to be direct about something." "Go ahead," she said. "I've been paying attention for a while now," he said. "And I want you to know that I understand what that means given your situation. I'm not in a hurry. I don't want you to feel like there's—" He stopped. He picked up his water glass, set it down. "I'm making a mess of this." "You're doing fine," she said. "I just wanted to say that I'm not someone who's going to disappear when things get complicated." He met her eyes. "That's the whole thing. That's what I wanted to say." She looked at him. This man who had sat for 40 minutes without moving so her son could sleep. This man who read every briefing document she sent before their calls and had specific questions about them. This man who was direct not because he'd learned directness as a strategy, but because he appeared to genuinely find indirection exhausting. "I know," she said. "You know." "I've been paying attention too," she said. He smiled. A real one, the kind that didn't have anything behind it except itself. She did not immediately know what to do with a man who smiled like that. She'd forgotten what it looked like. Something uncomplicated arriving in someone's face. She filed it carefully, in the part of herself she was slowly, methodically reopening. The Global Supply Chain Leadership Summit in London happened in the spring of Elijah's 7th year. Carter Logistics Consulting had, by that point, operations in 3 countries and a client list that read like a significant portion of the Asian-European freight corridor. The summit invitation had arrived 8 months before, keynote speaker, main stage, 10,000 attendees from 40 countries. And she'd accepted it and then put it aside because accepting it was a professional obligation, and she didn't give herself the kind of attention that might have made it feel larger than that. She flew to London with Elijah, who was 7 and had flown enough times to have opinions about airline snacks, and with Gabriel, who had been in her life for 3 years by then, in the particular way that people become part of your life when they earn each increment of it. Not with grand gestures, but with the accumulated weight of showing up, consistently, in ways both large and logistically minor, and meaning what they said, and being the same person in the morning that they'd been the night before. She stood backstage at the summit main stage on a Thursday morning and went through her notes one final time. She'd written the keynote herself, no speechwriter, because she didn't trust anyone else to say accurately what she actually thought, which was the same reason she reviewed every contract personally and sent every substantive email from her own hand. She heard the audience on the other side of the curtain. The ambient noise of 10,000 people settling, the sound of a large crowd arranging itself toward attention. Elijah was in the front row with Gabriel. She knew this because she'd checked, twice, from the wings. The moderator introduced her. She heard her name, heard Carter Logistics Consulting, heard a list of her professional achievements read aloud in the voice of someone who found them impressive, which she registered with neither pride nor discomfort, but simply as information about how she appeared from the outside. She walked out onto the stage. The audience rose. She hadn't expected that. A standing ovation before she'd said anything. Just for arriving, just for walking across a stage that was lit too brightly and smelled of industrial carpet and the particular atmosphere of large conference spaces. She stood at the podium and looked out at 10,000 people standing, and she felt not what she would have expected to feel years ago. Not vindication, not the particular satisfaction of a proved point. She felt something quieter than that. Something that had taken years of precise, undramatic daily labor to grow into. The specific piece of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, having arrived there by the only means that produce lasting arrival, which is surviving the journey honestly. She waited for the applause to settle. She said, "I want to start by telling you something that didn't make it into the official biography." 10,000 people waited. 7 years ago, she said, I sat alone in a hospital waiting room in Seoul, holding an ultrasound photograph of my son. My husband wasn't there. He had somewhere else to be. She paused. That photograph is on my desk in the Seoul office right now. I look at it every morning, not because I want to remember the pain of that day, but because I want to remember the decision I made on the drive home from that hospital. Not a dramatic decision, a very quiet one. I decided that my son was going to grow up watching a woman who did not let the worst thing that happened to her become the largest thing about her. The room was completely still. Everything I'm going to tell you today about supply chain architecture and strategic infrastructure and building systems that outlast their founders, all of it comes from that drive home. Not because heartbreak teaches you logistics, but because the clarity that comes from losing something you thought was foundational forces you to find out what actually is. She looked at the front row. She found Elijah's face, 7 years old, in the good shirt Gabriel had suggested he wear, sitting up straight with the particular posture of a child who has been told this is an important occasion and has elected to take that seriously. He was watching her with an expression she recognized because she saw it in the mirror sometimes. Attention, precision, the look of someone who was recording what they saw. She thought, he's going to be okay. And then more quietly, he already is. She gave the keynote, 45 minutes, 3 sections, a specific thesis about resilient system architecture that she'd been developing for 2 years, and that landed in that room exactly the way she'd intended it to land. Not because she'd performed it correctly, but because she meant it, and meaning what you say has a quality that performance lacks. An edge of genuine weight that audiences feel even when they can't name it. The applause at the end was the kind that has layers, the immediate response, and then the secondary wave that comes when a room processes what it actually just heard. She walked off the stage. Gabriel was there, in the wings, with Elijah. Elijah walked straight to her and wrapped both arms around her waist and pressed his face against her side the way he'd done since he was small. And she put one hand on the back of his head and stood there for a moment, in the industrial-smelling wing of a London conference center, in the middle of the largest professional moment of her career, and felt the weight of him against her as the most important thing in the room. "You were great," he said, into her jacket. "Thank you," she said. "Gabriel said you'd be great." She looked at Gabriel over the top of Elijah's head. He raised his eyebrows slightly. The expression he'd developed for "I may have created unrealistic expectations." And she looked back at him with the expression she'd developed for "You were right, so we'll let it go." In 3 months, they would be engaged. Not because of a grand moment, but because of an ordinary evening in the Seoul apartment when Gabriel was helping Elijah with a geography puzzle, and she was working at the kitchen table, and she looked up and saw the room as it was. The lamp, the puzzle pieces, the two of them debating the location of Madagascar. And she thought, this is the one. Not because it was perfect, because it was real, and she had learned, at significant cost, the specific value of real. She would say yes the way she did everything now, precisely, without doubt, having examined the evidence and reached an unambiguous conclusion. But that was later. Now, in the wings of the summit stage, she took her son's hand and walked with Gabriel toward the venue corridor and the afternoon light coming through the high windows. And she did not look back at the stage, because looking back was a habit she'd spent years breaking, and she was not going to start again today. Luca saw her from across the lobby. She saw him see her, which was different from seeing him. He was part of a business delegation. She recognized 2 of the other men with him from the Seoul freight world, and he was in a suit that fit him the way his suits always had, with the particular authority of a man who understood that appearance was a tool. He looked, from across the lobby, like himself, which meant he looked like the person he'd always been, which was both more and less than what she'd once believed. He crossed the lobby. She waited. She let Elijah's hand go, a quiet adjustment, not pulling away, just releasing. And she watched Luca walk toward her with the specific attention she gave to things that required her full presence. He stopped in front of her. He looked at Elijah first, which she registered. The boy studied his father with the frank evaluative interest he brought to most things. Elijah Moretti Carter, who spent the first 3 years of his life in Busan and the last 4 in Seoul, and who knew his father in the particular way that children know parents, they see on schedules rather than daily, as a specific, bounded, real relationship that has its own shape because it has always had its own shape. "Hey," Elijah said to Luca. "Hey," Luca said back, and the warmth in his voice when he said it was real, which Naomi had long ago decided to be grateful for rather than complicated by. Luca looked at Gabriel. "I don't think we've met." "Gabriel Okoye," Gabriel said. He extended his hand. His voice was level and entirely without performance. They shook hands. Naomi watched 2 men look at each other with the specific mutual awareness of their positions in the same story, and she registered that both of them were handling it with more dignity than the moment required of them, and she filed that under evidence that people can occasionally be better than expected. Luca looked at her. "You were remarkable," he said. "Up there." "Thank you." "I mean—" He stopped. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her in the courthouse corridor, the way he'd looked at the ultrasound photograph, with the specific expression of a man who has run out of all his useful interpretations and is encountering what's actually there. "I mean it in the larger sense, all of it." She said nothing. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait, not as a tactic, not as a withholding, but because sometimes the right response is simply to let someone finish what they came to say. "I would trade everything I own for one more chance," he said, quietly. Not a performance, not a legal strategy. Just the particular sentence of a man at the bottom of something he'd spent years excavating toward. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, she was aware of Gabriel's presence, quiet and unhurried. Beside her, Elijah was watching a group of conference attendees with the distracted interest of a child who has already processed the emotional temperature of the adult conversation and filed it as manageable. "You missed the appointment where our son first heard his heartbeat," she said. Her voice was not hard. It was not warm. It was exact. "You missed the years when he learned to walk. You missed the first time he laughed, which was at a face his father made. Except you weren't there, so I don't know what face. Someone else's. You missed every ordinary morning that built what he is." Luca accepted this. She watched him accept it, the way she'd watched him accept things in the courthouse corridor, completely, without deflecting it into defense. "You didn't lose me today," she said, "or at the hearing, or when I walked out of the apartment. You lost me the day another woman's birthday mattered more than your child's first heartbeat." She paused. "I think, somewhere, you knew that. I think you've known it for a long time." He looked at her. His eyes were doing the thing she'd looked away from in the courthouse corridor. She didn't look away now. She let him have that because she wasn't protecting herself from his pain anymore, and she wasn't punishing him with it either. It was simply his, and she was simply witnessing it, and that was all it needed to be. "I have," he said. She nodded once. "Elijah loves you," she said, "in the way he knows how to love you, which is real. Take good care of that." She turned. She picked up Elijah's hand. She met Gabriel's eyes, and he gave her the smallest nod, not asking anything, not offering anything except presence, which was exactly what presence was for. She walked through the London Conference Center with her son and the man who had arrived in her life through the side door of professional circumstance and stayed through the much harder door of honest, demonstrated intention, and she walked toward the afternoon light coming through the exit, and she did not look back. The story she would tell, later, about what came next was not dramatic. Carter Logistics Consulting merged with Gabriel's investment firm in the following year to create a new entity that operated across 4 continents and became, within 3 years, one of the most cited examples in the industry of what supply chain architecture looked like when it was built by someone who understood systems from the inside out. She spoke at 14 conferences in 5 years and wrote one book, which was about logistics, and also, between every line, about what it costs to mistake strategy for vision and efficiency for humanity. It sold to an audience much larger than the freight industry because books about those things always do. She and Gabriel married on a Saturday in June in the English countryside, in a ceremony that had 40 guests and no photographers hired to document it for anyone except themselves. Elijah stood beside Gabriel as something the formal program called Junior Witness, which was a title they'd invented because best man felt wrong for a 7-year-old, and ring bearer felt insufficient for a child who had opinions about everything and had already decided, with the focused certainty that was his primary inheritance from both sides of his parentage, that Gabriel was someone worth keeping. Her mother cried. Gloria Carter, who had sat dry-eyed through a Korean custody hearing and a financial crimes briefing and the departure gate at Incheon, cried at her daughter's wedding with the particular uncomplicated completeness of a woman who has been holding it together for a long time and has finally reached a moment where holding it together is no longer required. Naomi did not cry at the wedding. She had cried already, on ordinary Tuesdays, in the shower, in the car after dropping Elijah at school, in all the ordinary small moments where grief for what her life had been found its way out without announcement. She had no tears left for ceremonial occasions. What she had was better, the specific, unperformative happiness of someone who has arrived somewhere real. In the private study of his Seoul penthouse, Luca Moretti kept a single unopened envelope on the shelf behind his desk. He'd looked at it every day for 8 years. He never opened it. He didn't need to. He knew what was inside, had known since the night she left it on the table beside the divorce papers, had understood its contents more completely with every year that passed and added to the list of things he had missed. The shelf held other things too. Awards, photographs of business milestones, a small jade figurine he'd bought in Beijing. But the envelope was the thing his eyes went to, always, in the first moment after he sat down at the desk. Not as punishment, or not only. As a fact he had decided to keep close, the way some people keep hard truths close because looking away from them costs more than the looking. He watched Naomi's television interview on a Thursday evening in autumn from the same chair he'd been sitting in the night the photographs spread online. The interviewer was British, young, with the specific earnestness of someone who had prepared well. Naomi sat across from her in a gray suit with a posture that Luca recognized. Not rigid, not performed, just the natural posture of a woman who had inhabited her own authority long enough that it had become structural. The interviewer asked what changed her life. Naomi was quiet for a moment. On his television screen across the ocean, in a well-lit studio in London, his former wife sat with the particular stillness of someone who has been asked a question she has answered for herself many times and is deciding, now, what version is true enough to say aloud. The day I realized that love without respect is only another prison, she said. I had been telling myself that what I had was love, and it was probably some version of it, but it was love that didn't include being seen, and a person who is not seen, regardless of what else they have, is living in a very specific kind of isolation. She looked at the interviewer. The moment I walked away was the moment my child and I finally began living. Not surviving, living. Luca reached forward and switched off the television. He sat in the silence that followed. Outside his window, Seoul continued its permanent self. The density of it, the light, the sound of a city that didn't stop for anyone's interior reckonings. He had built power in this city, and the power was still there, was real, had produced everything it was supposed to produce. Safety, influence, the particular kind of freedom that money provides when it's sufficient. He was not a man who had lost in the conventional sense. His empire was intact. His name still carried weight in rooms where weight mattered. The silence was absolute anyway, because there is a specific kind of loss that has no memorial and no legal filing and no public record. The loss of a family that existed only briefly, in the small hours and the ordinary mornings, and the single moment when you feel a life move under your hand on a Tuesday night and understand for the first time something true about what matters. The loss of all the moments you chose against. The accumulated weight of every ordinary thing you decided could wait. He reached to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer. He took out a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote one sentence. Elijah, call me when you're ready. He put it in an envelope. He addressed it to the sole office of Carter Logistics Consulting. He sealed it. He set it beside the other envelope on the shelf, the one she'd left. He looked at them both for a long moment. 2 envelopes. The whole distance between who he'd been and what he'd learned contained in 2 plain white rectangles on a shelf in a room no one else ever entered. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the dark, in the silence, in the city he'd built his name into, and he let the evening be what it was. In London, in a house that smelled like cooking and old books and the particular atmosphere of a place where a child lived fully and loudly and without apology, Naomi Carter put her son to bed. She read to him from the book they were working through, a long one, the kind with chapters, which he insisted on despite being past the age where she was required to read to him, because he liked it, and he had already learned from watching the primary adult in his life that there was no virtue in abandoning things you liked simply because you'd outgrown the version of yourself that first loved them. He fell asleep mid-chapter. She marked the page. She sat beside him for a moment in the lamplight, this boy who had her hands and Luca's particular stillness when he was thinking and something that was entirely his own, a quality of attention, a directness, an absence of performance that she recognized because she had fought very hard to keep it in herself and had apparently, somehow, passed it intact. She turned off the lamp. She went downstairs. Gabriel was in the kitchen, finishing the dishes, which was a thing he did without being asked and without mentioning it. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. This man, this ordinary, extraordinary man, standing at a kitchen sink in a house that was hers, and she felt the evening settle around her. He looked over his shoulder. He asleep? Chapter 9, she said. Good chapter. Good chapter, she agreed. She sat at the kitchen table. She pulled the proposal she'd been working on toward her and opened it. He dried his hands and came to look over her shoulder for a moment, not interfering, just seeing what she was doing, the way he always looked at her work, with genuine interest and complete respect for the fact that it was hers. The Tokyo paragraph, he said. I know, she said. I'm fixing it. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something. I was going to say it's close, he said. It's not close, she said, Ed, but it will be. He kissed the top of her head. He went to make tea. She looked at the proposal. Outside the kitchen window, the English countryside was dark and quiet. No city noise, just the soft, particular darkness of a place that became completely itself after the sun went down. She thought about a woman who had woken before sunrise on a morning in Seoul 7 years ago with one quiet hope. She thought about a hospital waiting room, about a small white envelope, about the specific sound of a heartbeat she had heard alone, in a room with an empty chair, and carried out into a world that had proceeded, despite everything, to give her exactly what she'd been asking for. Not what she'd asked Luca to give her. What she'd built herself, from the specific material of what she actually was, in the time that opened up after she stopped waiting for someone else to see it. She picked up her pen. She got back to work.